Perfect. Very good.
Mhm.
All right. Thanks, everyone, for joining us for this recording of our E-Rate Category 2 and U workshop. Brian and I really wanted to get the word out to as many libraries as possible, so we are recording the talks that we did around the state last week. I am Wendy Knapp, the Deputy Director of Statewide Services at the Indiana State Library, and for a while I am going to be the E-Rate contact until we get a new E-Rate State Coordinator in place. And I'll let Brian introduce himself.
Hi there, my name is Brian Hubbard. I am the Manager of Customer Services for the Midwest for Education Networks of America, or ENA.
All right, so what we're going to do today is go over, are you able to move the slide, Brian? There we go. We're going to go over general stuff about Category 2 E-Rate, about E-Rate in general, rules and things that we have to make sure that you are aware of for applying for any funding that you would apply for. And then we'll talk about some of the available Category 2 funding that is out there for some Indiana libraries, and any Indiana libraries that are working on this. If you have questions about your Category 2 levels of funding, if you want to contact either me or Brian with those questions, either one of us is happy to answer those, whether you're an ENA customer or not. And then Brian is going to talk a little bit about ENA's Wi-Fi solution that is a Category 2 eligible service that's out right now. And then we had time for Q&A, so what we'll do is try to remember some of those questions that we got out on the road last week and try to cover those as we can today in the recording. So E-Rate Category 2 and U, I am going to borrow heavily from Lauren Abner. She is the E-Rate State Coordinator for the Kentucky Library, and she does a lot of really great presentations, has step-by-step instructions for every little step along the E-Rate path that I can share with any of you if you would want to start filing forms on your own. If you just want the resource to know how it happens, I can share that with you. But for today, I'm borrowing heavily from her to talk to you about E-Rate Category 2. So today, we were going to cover why we're talking about Category 2 and why it's so important to get this done as soon as possible, and why we felt the need to have the recording after we did the road shows last week. And one key thing here is that the Category 2 funding that was put out in funding year 2015 was released for 5 years, and we don't know if it will continue after funding year 2019 or July 1st next year, that funding year once that starts. So all we know for sure is that not a lot of schools and libraries have applied for it, and the whispers in DC are that, oh, well, maybe this isn't that necessary. So we want to be sure that you're aware of this and you're applying for it if it does fit for your library and your budget. So we'll talk about what Category 2 will cover, and I'll let Brian go into more detail on the eligible services list after we get through my part. And then I'll talk a little bit about how you can file, and I'll talk a lot about the rules that you have to follow, because that is very important for program integrity. And then I would just say that I am not with the FCC. I am not with USAC. I am not even a full-time E-Rate consultant. So I am on the ALA E-Rate Task Force, and I do my best to keep abreast of what's going on with that, how the FCC is feeling about the program, how USAC is interpreting the program, and how it's being used in libraries across the country. So I will give you my best attempt at those interpretations today. So an application cycle for Category 2 looks pretty much exactly like the application cycle for Category 1. Basically, we have the first part of the application cycle is the competitive bidding process, or the Form 470, as E-Rate likes to call it, and that is open right now. We don't know how long that is going to be open. That is dependent upon the next step, the 471 request discount portion of the cycle. And that is a window that is opened by the FCC at some time, and they tell us when it closes. And when that happens, that's kind of the calendar we're working with. So the only thing we know for sure is that from the time that the 470 is released, it needs to be out there for a minimum of 28 days. So you'll have to make sure that you allow time for that in any planning that you're doing. Moving a little further, the lightning bolt there is USAC's funding commitment decision letter, because their decision comes down from on high, and you get a letter that tells you how much of a discount your library will get. And then the funding year starts, as I said, July 1st of 2019 and goes through June 30th of 2020, this one funding year that we're talking about. And then, of course, we have the invoicing methods for whether we would do SPY or Bear, and we can get into great detail another day about that, or if you have questions about that, just email us, let us know. But we are talking about something that looks to be way in the future, and it is really not that far into the future, because when the FCC does open the 471 window, it'll likely be, what did we hear? Mid-January, I think was the last rumor I heard. And it'll be open through early to mid-March. So that's what we're looking at. So, okay. So Category 2, actually Category 1 and Category 2 are both covered in the eligible services list. And this is a list that does change a little bit every year. We have the link there to the eligible services list page, and like I said, we'll go through that in a little bit more detail later. But what I wanted to cover was that there are the two broad categories on this list. Category 1 is connecting to the internet, and so that is really getting the internet to your building. Category 2, what we're talking about today, are those connections within your building, getting the internet to the devices. That kind of connection is what we're really going to focus on today. It is a very limited menu of services that can be purchased with the E-rate discount. And so the biggest change probably I've seen has been the phase out of the phone support. And as you all know, because we've all seen that decrease over the last few years, that's pretty much gone now. So we're down to only having E-rate support, internet connectivity, and specifically getting broadband to schools and libraries. So if you have finished your fun summer reading, your beach reads, and you're looking for something to keep you awake at night because it's just such a page turner, there's this 14-page document of the eligible services list, and it reads like a government document. It reads like a legal memo, because that's exactly what it is. So it's very dry and can seem very Greek if you're not necessarily following all the technologies around networking and internet and broadband access. So don't worry about that. If you have questions, let us know. So what about Category 1? Well, we are not going to talk about that today. It is a huge part of the E-rate discount that we get. It is the discount for internet access, and if you're in the consortium, we file for this on your behalf through AdTech. So it's taken care of. If you're not in the consortium, still, I hope you're filing for this, because it is very important in our state. Last year, the average discount for libraries for just the broadband Category 1 connections was 73%. And then, of course, we have the additional Internet Connectivity Fund that is from the Indiana General Assembly. They approve that in the budget every other year. And last year, we were able to cover 87% of the non-discounted portion. So we are able to say that all the local libraries do have some buy-in. They are putting local money into this, and it is important for them to get that high-speed broadband. And the state is also really helping out the libraries too, as they need to, be the local branches of other state offices and things. So we can go on. Today, we're just going to talk about Category 2. So do remember all that about category 1. It's important, but the reason that we wanted to record this and get this out to you guys is that, as I said before, we don't know how much longer this funding is going to be available. To be perfectly honest with you, when the rule was changed and it came out and they said, okay, we've got this 5-year influx of money for category 2 for getting, your connections within your building set up to support good high-speed broadband, we all kind of thought, okay, well, it's always been there and it's always been kind of tough to get. And so they're just making it easier to get. So they'll keep it there after this 5-year period is up. Well, we're almost at the end of the 5-year period. And so far there's no indication that they will go forward with it. Like I said, the only whispers we're hearing are that nobody's really applying for it. So why are we putting all this money and effort into a program that nobody really seems to want the money for? So we recognize that that's not necessarily the case, that there are a lot of reasons why libraries are not applying for Category 2 services, and we just want to eliminate as many of those barriers for you guys as possible. So Category 2 is only these things right here: broadband internal connections, managed internal broadband services, and basic maintenance of internal connections. So it is really limited to like I said, the connection to the device within your building. For any libraries that have multiple buildings, the connections between your buildings are Category 1. So it's really just within the individual building to the device. So I just want to take a moment. I just want to pause and let everyone think for a moment about what happiness is, because on the previous slide I had typed Category 2 is and then an ellipsis, and I personally can't type noun is ellipsis without singing this song from Your Good Man Charlie Brown in my head. So if you don't know it, you should look it up. It's a fun little song. And now that you've had a few minutes to think about what happiness is to you, I'll tell you that to me it's my greyhounds, and we can move on and talk about CIPA compliance, which libraries love talking about CIPA. Of course, the Children's Internet Protection Act. So I think we're at a pretty good place with this in Indiana for the most part. Libraries have gotten their technology protection measures in place. Their filters are there. And then being an Indiana library, you do have these extra laws that were put into place. And I don't know why. I assume it was around the same time as CIPA. But you have to have your internet safety policy by Indiana Code 3612-112. And you have to hold a public meeting prior to adopting that policy in the same chapter and verse of the law there. So you're already covered by that. So we are mostly good to go. The timelines for this money, we are definitely at the mercy of the FCC. What we do know for sure is that the bidding process has to be fair and competitive. It has to be open. It has to be right out there in the sunshine, all those laws we have about sunshine laws, about open door laws, all those things. That's all true around this too. So the 470 will have to be available for a minimum of 28 days before you can do the 471 or sign any contracts or make any decisions about what products and services you would get. That, like I said, the 471, the rumor is it'll be between January and March. We don't know. Just the sooner you file for these services, the better. So what is your Category 2 budget? And those libraries that came to the roadshow had a really extra great bonus of having Brian do all the heavy lifting for them. And he figured all the Category 2 budgets for each building. So basically what it comes down to, and if you have questions about your Category 2 budget, reach out to me or Brian, like I said, and we'll work with you on getting that for you. But it came down to looking at of course, the percentage of students that are on the free and reduced lunch program. However, it was only for the school district where the main library sits in the case of Category 2, which is very different from Category 1. Also different from Category 1, the rural and urban classification is different. It's not just based on what county you're in, it's your rural or urban classification code according to IMLS, and we've got all that. And then we look at the Category 1 discount matrix, and Those 10 libraries at the bottom of the slide here are the 10 libraries in the state of Indiana that for Category 1 get a 90% discount on their services. And under Category 2, the maximum discount is 85%. So for those libraries, that would be the maximum discount level they would get. Everyone else, it would be the same 50%, 60%, 70%, whatever your percentage is. And then, of course, we had to have the square footage of each individual branch because each individual branch does get its own individual budget. And I'll let Brian go into all the confusion that is. And then, of course, if you have any previously committed Category 2 services from this round of funding. So competitive bidding. Let's talk about these rules. So on the 470, you will describe what E-rate eligible services you're actually trying to get for your library. When we're talking about Category 2, we're talking about those three things: the internal connections, the managed internal broadband, and the other thing. So when you've got those on their 470 and you've released that, you absolutely positively have to leave that out for a minimum of 28 days. If you need to take more than 28 days because you have an RFP also, and we'll talk about RFPs in a minute, you can do that, but it just has to be that minimum of 28 days. I would note that at this point, filing the 470 and just asking bidders for quotes and things is not an obligation to go forward with any of the funding. You can decide that it's just not worth it and give up at any point, but you cannot get any further than into getting the money unless you do the 470. So it's kind of a big, important first step. So for the open and fair bidding process, this is very, very core to E-rate, and this is one thing that the FCC and USAC have been careful about over the years to make sure that we are keeping the program very much intact and that we're not allowing waste, fraud, and abuse, and that people are following the rules they need to follow. So key things on the open and fair bidding process is you're going to do everything out in the open. You're not going to keep any secrets. When one vendor asks the question, let all the vendors know what the questions were and what the answer is. We do this with the RFP process for the state for anything that we put out to bid, and we don't even necessarily know who the questions are coming from. We just know that the vendors that are considering bidding have questions, and then we have to put out the answers to those questions, and we have to put that out on the same document that the RFP is on so that all the vendors know every step of the way anything that changes. And if something does change significantly based on vendor questions, and it has happened, it happened to us with the Category 1 RFP we just did, the vendors may ask some really great questions that you just hadn't thought about because that's not what we do as libraries. If it significantly changes the 470 or the RFP, then you have to start your 28 days over again. So just be aware of that. Oh, and then of course, you're not going to accept any gifts from vendors, of course, anywhere along in the process, right? No, you're not. So what can you do when you get all those bids in and you need to evaluate them? Well, the one thing you're going to have to do is make sure that cost is assigned the highest point value on your bid evaluation. This doesn't mean that the cheapest vendor is going to win. There are a lot of other factors that you want to consider when you're evaluating bids for products and services, and we have some example matrices that we can share with anybody who wants to see those. So we've got a few that I'll show you in a little bit, but you can consider factors like your previous experience with the vendor, whether the vendor will do the E-rate discount where they do the paperwork to get the discount and they just give you the discounted bill. I mean, that's one of the things you can consider. So there's a lot of things you can consider. We'll go through all that in a little bit. So why would you want to go to all the trouble of doing an RFP and all the additional paperwork that takes when you're already doing a lot of paperwork in order to even apply for and get E-rate in the first place? And there are a lot of options. There are a lot of reasons why you would want to. When it comes to Category 2, it really seems like in order to get down to the level of specificity of what it is that you really want and need for your library and your community, having the RFP as an extra tool in addition to the 470 is actually a really helpful step. Just one small example, the narrative field on the 470 is limited to 5,000 characters. So you really can't get into that much detail as to what it is you're looking for in that kind of limitation there. So it does make you consider a lot of things in a lot of different ways than just going through and filling out the 470. So it's worth doing, I would say. So this is one example of a bid evaluation matrix. You can see that you can give points for whether they're a local or in-state vendor. If they do price out ineligible services, products, or fees, you have to cost allocate those out. But USAC has this example, and then on the next slide, E-Rate Central is another great E-Rate consulting firm. They have just examples on their website of anybody can grab this and they can save this to their local computer and make this their own. So you can rate the vendors on whether they understand your needs. One thing I found on especially anything that we do related to E-Rate is when we get bids that say your school can blah, blah, blah. Well, very clearly they're not reading closely. So we can know that they're not really understanding our needs, that we are a library, not a school. So there are other examples out there. I've got 3 on hand here. I can just send you out anytime you'd want to see them. So that's those. One thing is that you do have to keep all the paperwork. When the FCC came through and changed E-Rate and said we're going to give this influx of money to Category 2 and we're going to stop funding phone services, one of the other things they changed was they said you have to keep all the paperwork for a period of 10 years after services end. So the comments that came back said that seems like a really long time, and that's a pretty big ask, and we really have to keep these files for that long when we don't have to keep anything else for that long. And the FCC basically just said, yeah, we know it's a big ask, but we are really concerned about compliance with statutes and rules, and we want to be sure that we can prove that this program is done with the utmost integrity. So that's the rule. So all of that was just going through the first box on our timeline slide there. So we really were just getting up to the point that you would select the vendor and file that paperwork. So now that we're to that point, let's talk a little bit about how you can select the vendor. So the 471 is how you do that. You can sign contracts, of course, too, but the 471 is how you tell USAC and the FCC, this is the vendor that I'm going to get the E-Rate products and services from, and we want the discount, please. So you have to file that 471 every single year. So even if you do a 470 for Category 2 services for multi-year contracts, you do have to do the 471 every single year. And you'll know that from just if you do it within the consortium, we have you fill out the paperwork every single year. We only bid out the contract once every 4 years, but then we do have to fill out the 471 on your behalf every single year. And you will have to do separate 470 and 471 for the Category 2 services. And of course, we don't know what the deadline is. So Lauren Abner, my friend from the Kentucky State Library there who does the E-Rate coordinator position there, has, like I said, a lot of great resources on her website. And in one of her hundreds and hundreds of pages of resources, she has elements of a good contract. And I just thought I'd share some of those elements with you today. There are additional things that you can consider when you're looking for vendors. One thing that I would note is that when you do put your 470 out there, it's going to be out there for every vendor across the country to bid on. So one thing that you could do if you did an RFP in addition to the 470 is you could require an in-person meeting so that you can make sure that you're going to get a vendor who's, if not having local representation, at least cares enough to send somebody to that first meeting to see your building, to see what it is you're looking at. And it's a very simple ask in the RFP process, and it's a simple way to weed out the people that are just really just filing mass replies and not really caring whether they get the business or not. One other thing to note, this is highlighted on this slide, is that you can ask for specific brands, models, and SKUs for equipment. One thing I would say is with the state, they strongly discourage us from doing any kind of brand name ask on anything we bid out. They don't say you can't, but they do say that if you use any brand name description in anything you're bidding out, you absolutely positively have to use the phrase or approved alternative. So why would we need to do this? Number one, it's limiting competition if you say that you will only get brand XYZ of whatever. There are only certain vendors that provide brand XYZ, and so right there you've eliminated all the vendors that provide brand ABC. And then you also want to be careful that while you do probably want to go into specificity about, you know, different generations of Wi-Fi and things that Brian will talk about in a little bit, you don't want to box yourself into a corner and have yourself requesting only equipment that is already deprecated and not really useful anymore. So that's one thing you want to look out for when you're doing the contract. And then the second slide there, just really important things to have on the contract. It's funny because it's missed, but it's not funny when it is missed because that really puts E-rate funding into jeopardy. But, you know, what period the contract covers, the start date, and signatures of acceptance. So those are just key things to have on a good contract. And then Lauren's slides that are available to you there, you can see that she's gone through basically, and she has this for the 470 and for the 471. She has it for category 1 for the 470 and for category 2 for the 470, and she has it for category 1 for the 471 and category 2 for the 471. So you can literally go step by step and just whichever category 2 service you would want to apply for, you can just skip to those slides. And then she has pictures of the portal, screenshots that show little tips and hints that, you know, you can put this here or this is what this means, and it's really, really helpful. Between these and the USAC tutorials that are out there, it is completely possible for every library in the state to file their own forms on their own behalf if that's what they want to do. So I just basically don't want you to be scared. I want you to know there's lots of resources out there for you. And then if you do want additional help, of course, we have used AdTech for the last few years in Indiana. They're available. We've also used EdTech Strategies to do some E-rate consulting on behalf of Indiana libraries. And then, of course, E-rate Central that provided that really great matrix there, has all kinds of services available too. USAC is there to answer questions. I'm here to answer questions. And I can get you links to anything that I've shared so far today. So that's what I have for today.
Hello, it's Brian again. So I'm going to talk a little bit more about the Category 2 funding and give a couple of examples and step through kind of what the funding looks like. How does the funding information, you know, that we have available, how can we kind of share that with you so that you understand what money might be available to you, so that you can make some determinations around if this is something that you want to do, which we highly, highly recommend that you do. So let me show you some examples. Hold on a second. Let me click to this. So here's some examples of what the Category 2 budget looks like. And the first thing I want to clarify is when we say the word category, or the phrase Category 2 budget, this is a phrase, they use the term budget to basically mean what is the total amount of funding that is available in the Category 2 program for a specific location. So it's not the budget that you turn in to be able to get your funding for the year or anything like that, but it is their term for the money that's available to you. A couple of things to point out is if you look at a couple of these library systems, like the Mishawaka Penn Public Library system, you'll notice that they have 3 separate branches. And in this column here, that is the Category 2 budget, you'll notice that there are separate amounts. That is because every single library location has its own Category 2 budget or available amount of funding. So as you are looking at this funding as a potential source for you, you'll want to make sure that you are putting together the budget for any sites that you have. So if you have branch locations, you're going to want to determine what the available funding is for your branch locations in addition to your main location. If you're a single site, like for example, the Delphi Public Library, you're just going to have one bucket of money that is going to be able to be used for that single location. Another thing, as we're talking about the locations, that's important to remember is that when you are filing for funding for a specific location, the equipment that you purchase for that location must stay at that location. So for example, if you, I'm going to kind of make up some numbers, but if the Bittersweet branch here needed 2 access points for their Wi-Fi, but Harris branch needed 3, you can't later on say, well, Harris no longer needs 3, they just need 2, but now Bittersweet needs an extra one, and you can't just shift it around or move it. The equipment that you buy under the Category 2 program must stay at the location that it was funded for. One of the things that we do at ENA is when we are deploying our Wi-Fi service, we actually have very specific labeling conventions for all of the equipment that we install. So we actually attach labels to all of the access points, all of the switches that will indicate not only the location name, but it includes which E-rate funding year the equipment was purchased under, so that you could easily kind of look at a device and say, wait a second, was this something that we purchased in funding year 2017, or was it something we got in funding year 2019? In this table, for the examples that I have, you'll notice that we have the total Category 2 budget. Then there's a column here that says approved pre-discount, and then the final column is the remaining balance. For libraries that have not used any of their funding yet, you'll notice that it obviously says 0, so that they've not used any funding, which means that the remaining balance is the same as the entire Category 2 budget. For library systems like Penn Harris or Kokomo who have used some of their funding, you'll notice that then it calculates out. So for example, for Luann at the Kokomo Howard County Public Library, they've already used the funding that they have under Category 2 to be able to take care of the majority of the Wi-Fi needs and some of the switching needs that they have at several of their branches. They've also used some Category 2 funding for items related to their 2 bookmobiles. So they still have a little bit of funding related to their South branch and a little bit of a significant amount of funding still available for their main branch. And so as Luann was an attendee at one of the events last week, and we talked with her, she gave some examples of some of the things that she was looking at purchasing. Their Wi-Fi is in pretty good shape, but they definitely need new switches at the main branch, and so they're looking at that. Talking a little bit more about like the eligible services list, some of the other things that she could be doing in terms of the internal connections side of things would be to look at battery backup, so the UPSs. You can also get equipment racks. So like networking racks are a Category 2 eligible service item. So we can send in the presentation we had the link for the list for eligible services. We can absolutely send that to you so that you can get a better feel for the different things that are part of the eligible services list. Let's see, I think that's everything that we need to cover here on in terms of what some examples of what the funding numbers are. And as Wendy mentioned, if you'd like to know what your funding level is, just reach out to either of us and we can send that information to you. We'll break it out so that it has the information about each of the branches if you have branches, and then you'll be able to have a better understanding of what funding is available. Actually, as I'm thinking of this, as I'm talking, I'm realizing there was one more thing that we need to point out, is that this is the funding amount that is available. However, do keep in mind that your E-rate discount still comes into play. So for example, if you happen to be a 60% E-rate discount customer, it does mean that you are going to need to pay the 40%, the remaining local portion. You will have to pay that portion of that project. So when it says, for example, for the Delphi Public Library that there's $25,752 available, that is just the E-rate portion of that project. So there's still going to be a local portion that is required for you to be able to pay. Okay, so kind of stepping forward, we're going to talk a little bit about Wi-Fi in general, but also specifically some of ENA's solutions. There's a number of challenges with Wi-Fi in libraries, and we've talked a little bit about this in the past. In fact, when we did our first roadshow about Category 2 3 years ago, some of the slides that I'm about to show are kind of the same slides that we talked about 3 years ago. Some of those challenges continue to be the same challenges that we see when we are working with our library customers throughout the state. Obviously, resource and budget constraints continue to be a major issue. And one of the things that we hear a lot about is, and this was reinforced last week when we were with a number of libraries throughout the week, is that many libraries don't have an effective way of being able to report how much their Wi-Fi is being used. And that's very important for a number of things, not only from a funding standpoint and being able to understand, how is your service being used, but it's also important in understanding where is it being used. So if you have multiple access points, you will need to understand, well, are we seeing a high trend in usage in a certain part of the library? Also being able to understand, how is the Wi-Fi being used? And we'll show some examples of some reports that we have in the ENA Air service here in just a little bit. One of the biggest challenges that we continue to see also is that from a library standpoint, often our libraries are providing the only or the best free Wi-Fi in town. Not every community has a Starbucks or a McDonald's or another place that is offering free Wi-Fi. And so it's critically important that the Wi-Fi service that you deliver is going to be able to be up to the challenge of having a lot of users. Often our schools are sending students to you with their one-to-one devices to be able to take care of their homework or work on projects and things, especially for students who don't necessarily have internet access at home. They're relying on the Wi-Fi at the library to be able to get that work done. And then the final piece in terms of challenges, and we'll talk a little bit more in detail about this here in just a second, but Wi-Fi as a technology is ever changing. There's always new standards coming along, and so even if you think, oh, well, we just put in brand new Wi-Fi, 3 years ago, 3-year-old Wi-Fi is pretty old in terms of the Wi-Fi kind of standards and everything. So it's important to look at, as new devices are coming out, faster devices, and more of your users are coming into your library with more devices. It's important to understand the capabilities of the Wi-Fi network that you have and look at, is this the availability of this Category 2 funding, is this a good time for you to be able to move into some newer equipment that's going to offer some new features. So speaking about some of the solutions, and there's a lot of different types of solutions and a lot of different standards for the solutions. If you have Wi-Fi that is more than about 3 to 5 years old, you may have something that is what's called 802.11b or G. Wi-Fi that is somewhere between 3 and 5 years old would be 802.11n, and really anything newer than about 3 years is AC. There's also AC Wave 2, and there's a new standard coming that's already been ratified called 802.11ax. You don't necessarily need to understand these different standards, but what you do need to understand is that older Wi-Fi is slower. And not only is it slower, but it may not be able to support a large number of users connecting to a single access point. One of the things that we see, unfortunately, from time to time is we'll be talking to a library that might have basically just small office or home type of Wi-Fi equipment in the library. And that equipment is really not designed to be able to support the large number of users that we often see in the library environment. And most of the time, that home equipment also can't support the speeds that our end users are looking for being able to take advantage of. The original Wi-Fi standards were really built around coverage. And so for a long time, we generically, we would always say, well, I just need Wi-Fi coverage. I want to cover the library. I want to make sure that if a patron happens to be sitting in this corner, that we have coverage of the Wi-Fi to be able to get to that corner. And coverage is important. We have to make sure that we have the Wi-Fi radio signals throughout our building, and many times, as a library, we want to make sure that if there's a patron that's sitting in their car in the parking lot, that they have access, or if they're sitting on a bench outside, whatever it is, we want to make sure that we have coverage. But the second part of that is making sure that we design our Wi-Fi to be able to provide density. Density, again, basically means I want to be able to have a situation where I could have 30, 50, maybe even 100 devices that are attached to a single Wi-Fi access point. One of the challenges that we have seen from time to time is a library will have an existing Wi-Fi infrastructure, and they will then work with a vendor and say, well, we want to go from the older 802.11n standard to the 802.11ac standard. So the vendor, if they are not a very sharp Wi-Fi vendor, they may come in and say, well, we've already got cabling to all these places. Let's just disconnect the old wireless access point and plug in the new one. The problem with that is that these new standards, not only is it a new standard that has faster speeds and things like that, but these new access points have very different coverage and density models than the previous generation did. So simply putting an access point in the exact same spot where one used to be is not going to provide you with a very strong, optimized Wi-Fi environment. So it's very important that you work with a vendor that's able to give you a strong design, be able to install and support that service, and make sure that you've got a Wi-Fi solution that's going to give you both coverage and density throughout your entire environment. And again, it's important to be able to have the ability to do reporting so that you can take a look at what are the things that you are delivering across your Wi-Fi network. So ENA does provide our ENA Air service. This is a fully managed Wi-Fi service that is a Category 2 eligible service as what's called Managed Internal Broadband Service. So with Managed Internal Broadband Services, and the way that we deliver this service, we will work with you to determine how many access points are needed to be able to cover your library. And we can provide you with proposals that you could then use to be able to step through the 471 process and select ENA and be able to request the funding. And the way that it is designed is so that it is a monthly recurring fee. So as opposed to going and purchasing all the equipment and having to have it installed by somebody and put together and everything, ENA's service is a one-stop type of shopping experience where we design it, we install it, we implement it, we continue to manage it. ENA owns the equipment, and so you're simply paying a monthly recurring fee to essentially lease the equipment. So one of the key things about our service, in addition to just the technical side of things in terms of delivering a service that's going to give you the coverage and density that you need, but one of the things that, especially for libraries, that has been very important is the reporting piece. So to show you a little bit about what that does, these are some examples, screenshots of some of the reporting that we can do. And so this gives you the ability to be able to take a look at how many clients are connected to a specific access point. You can also aggregate that and be able to see how many clients are connected, for example, at your library on a specific day or a range of dates. You can also start to take a look at the profile information about the different access points and be able to understand kind of what is the performance of a specific access point if needed. Where it gets into some of the more detail that would help you in terms of how is your Wi-Fi network being used, there is information in the reporting tool about what types of traffic the Wi-Fi network is passing. So this is important for better understanding especially if you're in a situation where you start to notice that your bandwidth usage is going up significantly, kind of as you can see in this graphing. Clearly they had some Wi-Fi usage that was in this particular time frame, but then it continued to grow. So if you wanted to better understand what was generating that traffic, then you could start to take a look at some of the information about what were the different applications that were being used. So you could take a look and see that a certain percentage percentage or a certain value of that bandwidth amount was being used by YouTube. This over here showing information about how much traffic is going to Google, for example. And there's a number of other analytics that are part of the ENA reporting tool set that can be very helpful for you in terms of being able to provide information around how many clients are being used, how are those clients using the network. And the other piece is this can give you some idea if you start to notice that you have a specific access point that is under pressure. So if it has a lot of users connecting to it and it has a lot of traffic going through it, but you've got other access points that are not being used as much, we can work together to be able to determine if there's any fine tuning that we need to do to be able to make sure that the users in that specific portion of the library have a good experience on the network. In terms of ENA's experience with Wi-Fi, we deliver Wi-Fi services in over 32 states, and we have over 12,000 devices that we manage across a large number of states. In addition to the libraries in Indiana, we also work with libraries throughout the state of Mississippi under a statewide contract to deliver Wi-Fi services there. There's a lot of things that our service has done to be able to, as we developed this service, we wanted to be able to make sure that it was very functional, not only in terms of delivering a service for the library community, but we also wanted to make sure that it was E-rate Category 2 compatible so that libraries would be able to take advantage of the funding to be able to get this type of a service. And ENA Air is just one of the many service offerings that ENA offers in our kind of collective service offering that we deliver for library customers throughout the state. In terms of some of the questions, and Wendy, I'll let you pop in here also if you think of any, but some of the other questions that I know that we had from folks, there were some questions specifically kind of around well, more statements, I guess. We were sharing some information around Wi-Fi performance. I know one of the things that we brought up was the fact that sometimes we'll see patrons who come into a library with older devices, and older devices, because they have the older standard, sometimes those older devices will slow down a network. And so there are some strategies for being able to make sure that an older device that comes in, whether it is like a Nintendo DS or somebody's 10-year-old laptop or 15-year-old laptop that connects to the Wi-Fi at a very, very slow standard, there are some ways, some strategies for being able to kind of segment out that traffic so it doesn't slow down everybody who's connected to that access point. What essentially happens is the access point realizes, oh, I've got a slower device. I need to slow down everything so that we can hear what that device is doing. Well, that slowing down process means that everybody kind of suffers from it. So there's some, as I said, there's some strategies for being able to make sure that you can provide a good wireless experience to the newer clients, as well as continuing to offer Wi-Fi service to those older devices that might be coming into the library throughout the day.
And that is one of the things that is more unique to libraries than schools, because schools have greater control over the devices that their students have, especially in a one-to-one environment. You know, they're providing the students with whatever devices are going to be connecting to their Wi-Fi. And of course, we have nothing like that in libraries. We just serve everyone. So that is a big key difference between the services that we provide and the services that schools provide.
Mm-hmm. Wendy, I'm trying to think of what other questions or what other things. I know we did some deep dives into some pretty technical things, but I don't know that we want to necessarily do that. But I'm trying to remember if there were any other questions we needed to make sure we covered.
The only other thing that I would make sure that we cover, because I think you did a really good job covering some of the other things that are on the eligible services list, I would say one of the reasons that we went into some more detail on switches and UPSs was the question about integrating voice over IP for phones came up a lot, and libraries starting to do that. So that's one thing you want to consider for Category 2. And then another thing that Brian said at every one of these is that ENA is just one provider of the Category 2 services. And I would say that, you know, whether you apply for Category 2 services that are ENA services or not, whatever you apply for, just please apply for Category 2 services if you have a need for these internal connections or the Wi-Fi connections or whatever it is that you need in your library. Let's use this last year of the Category 2 assured funding and try to get as much of it in Indiana as possible.
Absolutely. I completely agree.
Okay.
I think that's good. I think if they just want to email us with questions, I think we'll be good.
All right. Thank you all very much.